So welcome and thank you for joining us. My name is Karen Corman and I have the privilege of being the Executive Director of the UIC Alumni Association. Welcome to the UIC Alumni Exchange Series. Each week, we work to bring you a variety of programs and topics so you can explore, connect, and even escape from the everyday with a community of UIC alumni, faculty, and staff experts. You'll hear me say this a few times today, but I encourage you to visit our website at go.uic.edu/alumni exchange for the latest and the greatest programming. And with that, I'm excited to start our program this lunch hour, if you're here in the Midwest, and hopefully you brought your lunch, by welcoming alumnus Jim Pressler, who will lead us in a discussion about the uncharted economic waters of 2020 as he explores some of the questions everyone is asking right now. Thank you so much, Jim, for being with us this afternoon, and I'll turn it over to you to begin the presentation and discussion.
Well, thank you very much, Karen. It's a pleasure to be here. And I'd like to thank the UIC Alumni Exchange for inviting me for this talk so that we can get together and share a virtual lunch while I offer a little discussion into the COVID economy and trying to explain what we've never been through before. So I thought I'd start off with a few quick ground rules about this, about what I plan on discussing and how I plan on going about this. I'm an economist, and that means I am going to focus on this from the economic point of view. I am going to step around politics, particularly the partisan discussion, as much as possible. I'm not a partisan. And on that note, I'm definitely not a virologist, so I'm not going to be discussing the intimacies of the COVID-19 virus itself, particularly because I don't know a lot of the details. The important part here is to be understanding both what we can expect looking forward and where we actually are right now. These are very misunderstood, and I think it's important to know these things. The important part, however, is I will not be spending a lot of time on how we got to this point. I'll be spending a little time on how I got to this point. I started off as a UIC student back in 1990, and there's the shameful proof of it. And the main thing I came to UIC looking for is a way to develop a good toolbox of ways to approach and put together a system of trying to look forward, to understand the world around me, and by taking what has happened, apply it to have a better understanding of what was yet to come. I graduated class of '94 and immediately went into economics. I worked at the Northern Trust Company for 20 years as an economist, and I've spent the past 5 years as a consultant for BTD Economics. And all the time taking the tools that I learned at UIC to examine the world around me and project how things were going to play out over the next few years. Now, during my career, this means I went through the NASDAQ bubble. I went through the housing bubble and the Great Recession. Internationally, I went through the Asian financial crisis, the Japanese false dawn, the Asian spring, a variety of coups, panics, crises, currency devaluations, bond defaults, sovereign defaults. You name it, I've experienced it. I don't say that to brag. I say it more to add a little gravity when I talk about the COVID situation and say, this one's new. This is different. I cannot honestly say it compares with anything. So in using the tools I learned at UIC, I said, okay, well, let's see if history can offer us maybe not something to directly parallel it, but something that offers a little insight. Maybe there's something to work with. Now, the two scenarios that come up actually don't get a lot of discussion in the economic world, but they were the recessions that came in 1919 and 1946. In blue is 1919, yellow 1946. These came both, as you may notice, right after the end of their respective world wars. And what you had is a lot of soldiers coming home looking for jobs, and a lot of industries that were supporting the war closing down. So you had this sudden mismatch of not a lot of jobs out there and a lot of labor out there. And at that point, you saw a sharp slowdown in the economy. But at that point, the question was, how long would it last? And as the graph shows, incidentally, these are from academic papers and not official government statistics, because the government did not carry such detailed statistics back then. But the recessions were sharp but short. So that gave me a starting point. Now, as a side note, when the UIC Alumni Exchange asked me to do this talk, they said, when do you want to present it? And I said, well, the Q2, the second quarter GDP report comes out at the end of July. So I'd like to be able to add that data to my graph. So we set up for this date. And then the second quarter GDP report came out. It was utterly horrible. It was also unprecedented. It was something that we had never seen in this country, or possibly any other country, to see a economy fall by fully 1/3 of its production over the course of a mere 3 months. So at this point, I started re-examining where we were and trying to figure out how to look forward. So at this point, I'd like to take a poll of just figuring out, okay, where actually are we at this point? Is this a situation where we are at the early stages of a depression? Is this just the first part of a recession, or even the low point of a recession? Or are we in fact perhaps seeing the beginning of a recovery? Now, I obviously wish I could give you the answers even while polling is going on, but ultimately this is determined by history. So while I can't cheat in that regard, I do see a lot of widespread, I'm getting a number of polls here, polling results here that are very interesting. There seems to be a certain amount, like a quarter of people are concerned that a depression is showing up. But that's closely followed by that this is the worst part and that this is a recovery even taking place, which I find fascinating, because at this point, it's, like I said, it's hard to say. Depending on where you stand, it could go one way or the other. The winner did turn out to be that this, almost half of the people suggested that this is the first part of a recession. And technically a recession did start as of February, but it's not the easiest thing to determine whether this is going to bounce back as quickly as we would like. So a little side note here, this is going to come up a little later, but back in the Middle Ages, it was believed that whenever a cartographer, a map maker, had to deal with uncharted, unmapped, and potentially dangerous areas, they would put a note saying, "Here be monsters," or "Here be dragons." And this basically represented a situation where there was not a known situation, but there was danger ahead of some form. So this kept the unsuspecting people out. I think it would be fair to say that a part of the outlook has to be covered with the statement of "Here be monsters," because there are some potentially very scary things lying ahead of us. So, having warned you accordingly, let's go over what a traditional recession is. Usually a recession means that production slows down. They're producing less in this quarter than we were in the previous quarter. This means that companies have to cut back, have to let people go, have to cut back hours. So you start seeing unemployment rise as jobs are effectively destroyed by the economic slowdown. This means that you start creating a situation where you have fewer jobs available and where you have more people trying to seek fewer jobs. Now, this is, nothing good ever comes out of this in the short term. Anyone who's been laid off can tell you that. But it does allow for a period of adjustment within companies. In other words, recessions are natural. They do happen. Ideally, they allow companies that were not very efficient in their process to either become leaner and meaner and tighten up and become more profitable and thus become job creators that start the growth cycle back into play. That's the problem these days. What we had was a recession that was not brought on by this natural lull in growth. Our economy was growing very, very well and in a nice steady pattern until we very abruptly took the wheels off of the economic bus. A number of companies had to shut down operations, and this was done not just in isolated areas, but in large sectors such as travel, entertainment, leisure. That sector alone lost $1 trillion of production in a quarter because there was no ability to provide hotel rooms. The restaurants were closed, cruises were shut down. And this happened at a time when the producers, when the people providing the hotel rooms and all the restaurateurs were not expecting it. The consumers were not expecting it. They had booked their trips, they had established their plans, set their vacations, and all of this had suddenly vanished. This kind of cyclical disruption takes away from what is a major tool of guidance that economists use. We have this growth and recession cycle that moves along very nicely. If you take away that, you take away the guidance that usually moves us along. So at this point, you've taken away our main roadmap to determine things, and we have to kind of work from fresh cloth at this point. While I'm discussing things that I don't like. Events without precedent such as this, we don't have other scenarios to work with. As you saw with 1946 and 1919, we had something to work with until the data said it was not comparable. So this is basically a crisis without guidance. This creates a lack of a consistent path to follow. At this point, we don't have the guidance, we have uncertainty. The markets hate uncertainty. Policymakers hate uncertainty. And in particular, economists hate uncertainty. So the first thing we then have to ask ourselves is there a time where certainty can be returned? And this immediately says, well, what about when COVID-19 is brought under control? And does this mean it eventually, is there a vaccine that brings it under control? It runs its course. However this may be determined, is that a time when the troubles that we're experiencing will dissipate and we can go back to doing what we were doing? Well, as we've seen from the number of small businesses closing down, from the number of places that have had to consolidate, furlough people, sell off, or file for bankruptcy, there's going to be sustained damage from this situation. There are places that are not coming back, and in some cases they are large names. We've seen it markedly in the retail sector, and again, what we're witnessing in travel, entertainment, and leisure is incredibly dramatic. But this isn't exclusively about them. While those jobs are not returning, there are entire supply chains that feed into those industries that are disrupted. To give a very odd example, 40% of tomatoes go into the making of ketchup, which is primarily used at restaurants and hotels. That supply chain has been thrown completely out of kilter because now you don't have the purchasing of ketchup, which affects the tomato growers, the distributors, manufacturers, processors, and transportation. All of those non-entertainment industries are affected merely because ketchup is not being used very much anymore. Putting this back together is not just something that can fall back into place. These situations have put a lot of companies into the red, so to speak. And that leads us to the other problem, which is debt. If there's one thing that hasn't been eliminated during this crisis, it's been debt. Debt is alive and well, and it's been piling up. And it's not going away anytime soon. In fact, it will be a burden for future growth. So I'm going to go back to a topic that has been discussed in the news. I'll try not to get too Economist-like with it, but there are what they call recession curves. And there's the V, the U, and the L curve. Now, I'm just going to keep this fairly simple. We look at 1919, 1946, and what we see is a sharp drop followed by a sharp recovery. It looks like the letter V, so conveniently, easily to remember. That's a V curve is fairly easy to remember, and we associate that with a sharp drop, but we return to a new normal. That is not that much different than what we had beforehand. A U curve, well, those are a little deeper and the recession is a little longer, but eventually you come back to the level that you're at. 1990 and 1946 are often associated with this. And we tried to do the same thing with the current situation. However, that's when we have to bring up the L curve. And the L curve, as you can tell by the letter L, is not a curve. It is a sharp fall in production that kind of levels off at the bottom and then tries to recover from a so-called new normal. When you have an L curve, it means that there have been a lot of companies which will be gone along with their jobs. You will have a certain amount of the job destruction that will not come back very easily, and in some cases not at all because an industry has contracted. As much as I wanted to think that there was a potential for a V or a U curve, I had to take pause again because of what we saw for the second quarter. So the next thing I wanted to associate with is the Great Depression. And funny story there. The Great Depression actually started off, as we know, in 1929, but by the mid-30s, the economy was growing again. It wasn't that great a depression. It was bad, but we had returned to growth, and some argued it was even healthy growth. The part that was overlooked is that the economy was very vulnerable. It is in that way similar to recovering from an illness and feeling good again, but knowing that you're very weak and very susceptible. In the case of the Great Depression, some bad moves were made by the Federal Reserve and the economy went back into a sharp recession. That put the Great in the Great Depression, as it were. This is now what I am looking at and considering as a scenario that might fit best While the depression part might be an exaggeration, well, we can't fully know quite yet. This is what history determines. So on that note, I'd like to take a second poll. And that says, well, when is growth going to start returning to our economy? Keep in mind, we're in the second half of 2020 now. Is growth returning now? Is it going to start up along with 2021? Is it by the end of next year? Or is this still a situation where there's no recovery in sight? Keeping in mind that, growth is a tricky word, and this is something where we have to allow history to eventually tell us the right and wrong of it. But I see a lot of people have growth. They're already jumping out to by the end of next year, we should have growth. About half of the respondents, not surprisingly, only a few people have believed that growth is actually returning right now. And interestingly enough, over a quarter of people believe there's no end in sight for this, which is, would be the hallmarks of a depression, or at least a recession extended so long that there could be long-term impact from having such a period of sustained economic contraction. So before I explain how those are actually going to play in, let me work from the discussion of what is the traditional response when we go into recession. And this might actually highlight some of the problems we have these days. Traditionally, we see the Federal Reserve lower interest rates. They want to give people more incentive to borrow, to take out credit, to buy things, to create economic activity. Unfortunately, the Fed has done as much as it can do with interest rates. It has lowered them as much as possible, and now the best it can do is make money available. But the interest rate option is off the board now. So now it relies on policy shifts. And this means that the policy options open are for the government to increase spending, for the government to become a consumer, to become economically active, and to cut taxes, which means that those who are economically engaged will have more money to engage with, to buy goods and services, to take out credit. Now, these are conventional routes to do things. However, there's become one problem with them, which is that with the current debt situation our country is in, there is a political sensitivity to raising debt, and both increasing spending and cutting taxes will trigger a growth in debt. So for those politicians who maybe have to deal with a constituency that is sensitive to the debt situation, they may be reluctant to take such measures because they would be out of office. So after all of that, let me at least bring up some good things. I'll at least push it towards what my forecast leads to. For one, any approach towards normal, any signs of growth would start moving us back towards the cycle, which economists rely upon, and it would provide a little guidance. It would provide us a direction to work with, or at least one to see if we can apply it. And in that regard, if we experienced any growth, this would be a positive measure. Any growth is assuring, especially considering the beating we took in the second quarter. Seeing a little growth in the third quarter would be wonderful. As of October 29th, the third quarter GDP report comes out, and I'm sure you'll be seeing it on the news because it comes out very close to election day. And we believe it's possible to see a little growth just because we're seeing a few more companies open up, allow for some business to take place, some economic activity can occur. So growth is possible in Q3, and this starts leading us back to say, okay, well, maybe does this allow the V curve or U curve to take place? Does it allow us to say maybe there is a recovery to the new normal? Well, I have to spoil that and say I believe we're still going to see a sharp fall that does not recover very quickly, and that is what the L curve is all about. But an L curve recovery is still a recovery. This is a positive sign to us. And this is probably the main takeaway, the thing that everyone can work with. If there is a recovery in place, if we want to see something moving along, good policies can help move this along, can help keep it sustained. This is a very tricky discussion, but if we compare it to what happened during the Depression when bad policies made things worse, in theory, good policies can be created as a lesson from those bad policies. But I warned you about the monsters. And sure enough, they're back for this. Any growth means that our economy will be expanding, but that doesn't mean it is no longer susceptible to shock, that it will still be very much vulnerable. Those supply chains I was talking about will still be in disarray. There will still be a lot of debt burdening companies and making it difficult for them to produce at the rate that would be considered productive growth. These are the known vulnerabilities, but in all fairness, since we're in unprecedented territory, there could be even more to worry about that we do not see at this point and that we have to prepare ourselves for coming soon.
So Jim, I have a couple of questions when you're ready, if I may interject.
Please.
So just for, I think right now as you're in this current discussion, the question came in is, how will the government spend money without an increase in taxes?
Well, when the government spends money and doesn't increase tax, the net result is debt. And in that regard, they would have to generate debt, which is what they've been doing of late. Now, there is an argument that says if you create debt to make things grow more than they are, it's not good debt. If you create debt to prevent a recession, it's better off than letting a recession take over the situation. Ultimately, yes, any tax cut, any increased spending is going to create debt. It's just creating the debt in a way where it is productive to the economy, where it creates things that stabilize the economy. That's called the good debt.
Okay, interesting. The other question that came in is, with the economy doing so poorly, how do you explain the recovery of the stock market?
Well, the stock market is projecting forward. It believes that there will be policies that will, for example, make sure that companies that are too big to fail don't fail. That there are ways to ways to say this is a short-term snag and the future is still fairly bright, and that there will be a form of financing corporate debt and helping them out so that we don't see catastrophic failures. It's much in the same way that in 2009, the stock market rebounded substantially before the economy had even returned to growth. So at this point, they're not looking at what's happening today, but what they expect in the coming year to 2 years. And I think the market's forward-looking eyes are something to keep in mind, both for better and worse, because if what the market expects doesn't happen, things are in for a sharp correction.
So a little bit along the same lines, I'll ask one more question and then maybe we can have you go back. The question came in, should consumers be paying off debt or should they be saving during this time?
Well, the important part of debt one is sitting on. Obviously, high interest debt, high interest rate debt, credit cards, stuff of the matter is you want to get rid of that immediately. As far as debt such as a mortgage goes or car payments, at that point, it might be worth looking into to do refinancing of it. I mean, ultimately, most debt that we have these days, the amount we pay on the debt is more than we can make if we save the money instead. If we can make more saving than the interest rate on the debt we're paying, we should save. But in this case, with interest rates low, I recommend most people to refinance their houses, to try to get like a 15-year mortgage instead of a 30, because interest rates are so low that the amount you save on the interest you would pay is more than you would ever get just saving the money and paying for 15 more years. So think of it as a trade-off between what you're going to make versus on saving versus what you pay on the debt.
It's a really great way to look at it. Please keep the questions coming in and I'll turn it back for you to continue presenting, then we can ask some more at the end.
Okay. Now this is my outlook here for, and I drew it two ways. As we can see, the growth beforehand, we were running at 2 to 3% economic growth before this year. And the slump on the graph, just to make it readable, I stopped at the second quarter drop at 10%. The economy contracted by 32.9%, which would go clear off of my laptop screen. So you have to understand what a deep fall that is. I drew out two scenarios, and one is under the assumption that stabilizing policies are brought into place. And this means we could return to modest growth this quarter being that it would be tough to repeat further contraction given what happened in the second quarter. But with policies that could stabilize or at least prevent some of the hemorrhaging in the job market, we could see modest growth for the next few quarters. The caveat is, of course, that if policies are not put into place that maintain a good economic system, then we would see some growth returning after a very bad second quarter, but it would decline very rapidly. And we would start feeling more of the fact that debt is too much of a burden on the consumer and on corporations. The corporations can't create jobs. The consumers can't purchase goods. And at that point, we would fall back into a second recession. Think of it as more of a compressed version of the Great Depression, where we witness a sharp fall in growth, a recovery, but bad policies promptly send us into a bad situation. So to understand what policy should be, let's understand what weaknesses we are facing right now. The national debt went up by $3 trillion since April. This is unprecedented. I'm not saying that that is a necessarily bad thing if the money goes to things that stabilize the economy. However, I do point out that it is a very politically sensitive issue, and that for those debt hawks who may be more concerned about debt than the economic policies, they will be resistant to larger situations that would in fact create more debt. But the handcuffing that takes place would could perhaps create political gridlock, which would not be to the benefit of the economy. Now, if debt is an issue with the government, it is an even more severe issue with the consumer. The category of failure to pay debts with the consumer, this includes getting cars repossessed. This includes apartment evictions, foreclosures on houses. This is becoming very dangerous. And so far there have been moratoriums placed on evictions and foreclosures, but these have not actually resolved any of the situations. These moratoriums are only postponing what would eventually have to happen if no further policies are done. An interesting statistic was issued that for the month of July, 38% of renters nationwide did not pay their full rent for the year. This is the most vulnerable part of the economy as far as the social sector goes, the renting sector. And at this point, you are looking at tens of millions of them potentially facing eviction by the end of the year. Such a homeless problem or such a reallocation problem would be catastrophic to not just our economy, but you would also have the supply chain issue, because keeping in mind that for those people who can't pay rent and have to leave, the apartment owners treat that rent as income and they would be out of income. Foreclosures would immediately put pressure on house prices, and you would have a lot of houses going on the market priced to sell, and you would witness a sharp drop in housing prices, which would also, eat away at the equity and the savings that a number of people, myself included, have built up. So at this point, these are some very significant weaknesses to think about when we look at what policy should be put into place. And this also matches up with the fact that the US has never really been an economy of saving. Savings took a severe beating during the Great Recession. And at this point, they still have not fully recovered. There's still a lot of debt eating away at them. And it is more difficult for people to tap into the savings to offset the job losses, the furloughings, the fact that there is a high unemployment rate, even higher if you consider furloughed employees. These are some severe weaknesses that have to be looked at. So to close, I will offer my secrets to the economic recovery. And this is what we should look for in policies. Any policy should approach the social safety net. Right now, people who are in debt and risk of repossession, foreclosure, eviction are going to depend on the social safety net. And when you start putting tens of millions of people onto that net, it's going to strain it. And perhaps it could give way if policy measures are not put into place to secure people. In that regard, something needs to be done regarding the consumer debt issues, again, as a part of the social safety net, to fold over and make sure that you do not have suddenly tens of millions of people declaring bankruptcy, going into outright foreclosure, and suddenly our country is experiencing social displacement, the likes that has not been seen since the Great Depression. And on a last note, unemployment. We know that the unemployment rate is above 10% right now, according to official statistics. If furloughed employees are included into that figure, it's more like 18%. And these are the numbers we haven't seen since the Great Depression. I bring up that term because a lot of programs were put into place during the Great Depression to stabilize this kind of situation. We aren't going to see 3 and 4% unemployment rates for several years to come. So we have to make sure that we find some way to maintain, to put these people either into some form of employment or some form of stability in order to keep the situation from getting out of control. In a normal recession, we don't see numbers like this, and we can rely on what we have in place. But we are talking large percentages of the economy are now facing what has not been seen before. But if good policies are put into place, the new normal can come along in a few years, and we might see something that we actually recognized before any of this happened. So on that note, I'll open the floor up to questions.
Thank you so much, Jim. So much to think about and process. And we do have a few questions coming in, and I encourage folks to keep putting them in chat, and we will get to as many as possible. So this question is, with the current backdrop of automation and other job destroyers, will we need a new system for the global population to thrive?
Well, right now, automation is a very interesting thing, because while it is a job destroyer, it also creates other jobs in different shapes of the economy. I think the focus on STEM education, for example, is a good way to start reallocating labor resources to working on being the ones who create the innovation, who develop the tools that, while these tools impact the manufacturing that we see in the automotive sector, that we see in most heavy capital areas, we do see the growth showing in the construction of the automation, in the developing of the science underlying this, and the creation of entire industries that can actually have a very positive influence on our economy in the long run. I just offer the fact that until the electric car became something worth being interested in, battery technology had never gone anywhere. And then people decided to find a way to miniaturize batteries and make transistors that could work in smaller objects. And suddenly the battery became a new industry, and it benefited so that we can now electrify many more things. So that transition, while it takes time and there is pain in that growth, the long-term impact can often be positive.
I appreciate your positive response to it and outlook. You had touched upon this a little bit earlier, particularly when you were talking about the U and the V and the L chart, but the question is, there was an economic downturn after the Spanish flu. Does that help provide any additional guidance for us now?
Well, the economic downturn that came from the Spanish flu was in part because of the return of so many soldiers coming back from World War I. So that kind of folds into it a little. It's hard to kind of tease out which one was influencing which. The Spanish flu did have a significant impact in that, and I promise this area. There were a number of people affected by the Spanish flu who were in their 20s, and they were in a prime workforce element, and they had a very high susceptibility for reasons unknown. But the main thing that was rippling through the economy was the returning of veterans and the adjustment of the economy that caused wages to fall. Unions broke down at the time, and you had a definite reallocation of income at that point. The Spanish flu itself was kind of hard to tease out of the figures at that point.
Interesting. A little bit of a change in question. Do you expect that this pandemic recession will increase America's economic inequality?
Unfortunately, I believe that's very much a possible outcome. As I pointed out with the eviction figures and 40% of renters not being in a position to pay their full rent, That's the dangerous part. Those people who are renting are not as economically secure as those who have a mortgage, who can tap into their equity, who can at least find ways to sustain themselves maybe for a year or so on, home equity loans and such. Renters are far more vulnerable, and they are also tend to be towards the bottom two quintiles of the economy. So in theory, they get pressed harder towards the bottom of the income distribution, while people who can make it through, who have extra funds, can watch the market dip and then buy up, uh, acquire capital at a discount and improve their way. So I do think there is a strong potential for this to really sharply increase inequality within our society.
So many layers of all of this. So this next person asks, besides gold, what other investments would be good hedges in this COVID economy?
Okay, well, I am trying not to issue too much investment advice, but I will offer this. In the COVID economy, we know what areas are taking the beatings. We know that, like I said, travel, entertainment, leisure is being savaged entirely. I know a lot of people who look at pharmaceuticals, but I believe those are speculative, knowing that if someone comes up with a treatment, their stock would go through the roof. I think at this point, during any emergency, a safe play is to sit back and, U.S. bonds are, not surprisingly, still being bought into quite a bit because it provides a structure and security of the US dollar. And even during global crises, people still refer to the US dollar as a place to, or if not the dollar, then dollar-backed securities, dollar-backed bonds, as a way to still retain that flight. It's a way to work the flight to quality, to be able to make sure you're not losing money. I know gold is very tempting, but I think gold has the downside of, if there's good news, gold goes down. So if you feel like things are going to be bad for a while, well, play accordingly. But if things do turn around, gold will not be a winner in that one.
The next one is a two-part question. And the first part is, can the government go to negative interest rates to stimulate the economy? Or would universal basic income be a good solution for the current economic situation?
Well, negative interest rates, and that's a very interesting subject. It's gotten a lot of press these days. What that mainly does, or its strongest effect, is it helps recapitalize banks, because in theory they can borrow on their own, borrow for themselves and pay back less, thus building up their reserves. The problem with that, of course, is that for consumers to take advantage of even lower rates, they have to borrow from people who are willing to accept thinner margins. So right now the banks are not struggling in a way that we're expecting, except for those exposed heavily to real estate, and that's kind of a separate discussion. So I don't think that's going to be high in the on the Federal Reserve's hit list. However, and could you repeat the second part of that question?
Yes, of course. Or would universal basic income be a good solution for the current economic situation?
Now, universal basic income is an interesting approach to things when jobs are very scarce. I do think that what we saw with the unemployment subsidies actually made an interesting statement to show that stabilized a significant amount of the population that had no access to jobs and was looking at long-term unemployment. That makes for a difficult situation to address when you look at it universally, because then you are talking literally trillions of dollars a year that we do not have. But as a way to secure the social safety net during a time when jobs do not exist, it's worth looking into. Again, maybe not as a permanent fix, but definitely when there are plenty more unemployed people than there are jobs available, something like that does provide a safety net.
So there's sort of a follow-up question about how does universal basic income work? So I don't know if you can elaborate on that for those of us that may not be as familiar.
Universal basic income is simply providing people with X amount of dollars as a government stipend per month or whatever. And in theory, that would be subtracted from any wages you made. So an employed person who was making $50,000 a year would receive their government stipend, and that would be deducted from their salary. But unemployed people would receive that stipend that would supposedly be a modest living wage. This way, people would not have to, when jobs weren't available, they would not lose their apartment, lose their house, lose their car, and be less available to enter the workforce again. And they would still be able to maintain a basic standard of living and take care of their health and not become less employable. So it's a fascinating experiment that's been tried to mixed results. A country of our size would not be able to afford it in the broader sense, but as a form of Social Security, it's an interesting thing to look at.
Thank you for that additional information and explanation. So I think we have time for one last question. I feel like with all of these, I should be saying, in your professional opinion.
My professional opinion.
Yes, in your professional opinion. The initial lockdown was terrible for the economy, but reduced pollution. Can our economy recovery align with environmental recovery?
That's a great question, because when we brought down energy production and car usage and everything, we did see that there can be an influence on the environment for the better. The real question, however, is trying to see how this can be implemented in a broader sense. I did take note that when gas prices dropped significantly during the lockdown, one thing that we did see is people trading in and buying SUVs. So in some regards, there's not, from some areas of the consumer, there's not an interest in working with the environment as much as there is as getting what we want and getting something which has poor mileage, but when gas was $1.30 a gallon, you would gladly take that offset. I do think it's an interesting opportunity to be able to look at what impact lower CO2 production has for the better in this case, and figure out how we can go forward looking at the more eco-friendly ways of taking things on. We're already seeing that different forms of power generation and more eco-friendly ways have taken place in areas like Germany, and they have definitely reaped the benefits of shutting down their more pollution-intensive industries in exchange for hydroelectric, in exchange for wind turbines, in very green ways they've done this, and it has been to their benefit. So now that we have the opportunity, I definitely think it's worth exploring. I know some areas are more set to take it on than others. The West Coast is far better for wind than the East Coast, and so on and so forth. But as a national strategy, I think it deserves a place in the discussion. So I will leave you with that.
Yeah, no, thank you. And thank you for the positive thoughts around all this. And Jim, we are so proud that you are a UIC graduate, and thank you so much for spending this time and presenting to our group today and sharing all of your knowledge. It's just been incredible. Real quick, please join us for our next Alumni Exchange event, which will take place on Thursday, August 27th at 6 p.m. Central, featuring UIC faculty members, writers, and producers, Carrie Sandoval and Ali Patsabas, and UIC alumnus TJ Gordon, as they explore the collective gains from the Americans with Disabilities Act, disabled activists, scholars, and artists who are demanding continued efforts to make the world a more equitable place for disabled people. This will be a unique program, and they will discuss a documentary film, Code of the Freaks, that explores disability representation in Hollywood. When you register for this program, you will receive a link to view the video prior to the discussion on August 27th. You can certainly find more at go.uic.edu/alumni exchange. And of course, please do be on the lookout for our survey to give us some ideas for future programming. Thank you again, Jim, for all of your time and your knowledge and your talent. We're so grateful for you.
Very much welcome.
Thank you so much. And thanks to all of you for joining us. And we look forward to seeing you again at the UIC Alumni Exchange. Enjoy the rest of your day and have a great one. Thanks again.